Welcome back to Logisticians Asia Pacific 2021. And as I mentioned before the break, we have our very first panel session of the day. That'll be all about the global economic outlook, challenges and opportunities for supply chains and logisticians today. And also, as I mentioned, this session will be broadcast on Singapore Radio, Money 89.3. And I'm really happy to welcome from Money FM 89.3, Rachel Kelly, senior producer and presenter, who will be helming this session. So without further ado, Rachel, can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Bob. That's right. This is Money FM 89.3. I'm Rachel Kelly, and today does mark the first day of Logisim Asia Pacific 2021 conference, organized by Logisim Sphere Exhibits, a subsidiary of SPH and Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. Now, the theme of this year's conference is Shifting Supply Chains, Transforming Logistics from Concept into Reality. And I think there's no argument that the past year has been like no other for many of us. But it's after every disruption that opportunities start to germinate and present the right moment for a reset as the economic drivers regroup for an upturn. Now, over the next 45 minutes in this panel, as part of Logisim Asia Pacific 2021 conference, we'll explore the diverse angles in the current and evolving global economic outlook. What are the imperatives for supply chains? How companies should prepare their strategic direction and organizational capabilities and tools to benefit from new market opportunities. And I'm very honored to welcome a diverse panel to share their insights with us today. We have industry experts. Let's start off with Joe Lombardo. Joe is a director, project and performance management at ESP Consult. Wolfgang Lehmacher, who is advisory board member at Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. Dr. Christopher Holmes, managing director at IDC Insights Asia Pacific. Scott Phillips, supply chain director at Global Shoes Production and Sourcing for ECCO Shoes, and of course, Dr. Raymon Krishnan, who's not only the president of Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society, but Raymon also handles Asia Pacific logistics for a US med tech company. Gentlemen, welcome to the panel today.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. Good to meet you.
Wonderful to have you all with us. And I know that I've spoken to all of you over the last few weeks, and there really is so much to cover in the next 45 minutes, because from the global pandemic to unexpected trade events such as the Suez Canal, changes in regulations, new trade partnerships, to sustainability and to new technologies, the industry really is abuzz with change. And to start off, I think it's important that we really do a lay of the land here. And Joe, I was looking at a recent Logisim publication, I believe it was March, and your front cover, I think, encapsulated it beautifully. It was titled The Beginning of the Beginning, a progress report on the digitalization of supply chains. And in some respects, the past year and COVID-19, the pandemic, has very much brought about the beginning of a new chapter for many sectors, including supply chains. Wolfgang, I think you highlighted this in a recent article as well, and you said what seems to be clear by now is that the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the vulnerabilities and risks of today's global supply chain network. So on that note, to get started, I'd like to ask each of you in one sentence to share with us what you think has been the biggest challenge within the supply chain sector over the past year. Joe, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Rachel. It's good to be with you and with the panel. The biggest issue that we are all trying to grapple with coming out of the COVID crisis last year is the speed and ferocity at which things have changed our life. We have seen companies struggle in all directions because maybe of their unpreparedness. They're struggling with the people themselves. They're struggling with technology. They're struggling with their conventional legacy systems. On the other side, we are seeing a major shift in our social systems. Our social system being ourselves, people, the way we live, the way we work, the way our lifestyle, the whole infrastructure on our family and the global network. And when you put those two big factors together, leaving aside all the political trade tensions, those two things themselves create a huge explosion in the way we understand the way forward. And that is what we can explore in more detail as we go forward. Now, given those factors, no one yet has found the final solution, but we're all trying to navigate through this uncharted territory of uncertainty, of risk, of loss of trust, of tension within the various areas and corners of where we work. So as an introduction, Rachel, I think I'd like to just pass those couple of messages for discussion.
Chris, over to you. What is your key highlight that you think the key challenge that you think has been highlighted over the past year, and the key message for those in the supply chain sector as we get rolling into the panel?
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, building on what Joe has said, and he's given a very, very global view. I mean, just to bring it down into what we're seeing across organizations, it's really been that uncertainty. There's one thing that organizations, businesses hate, it's uncertainty. And as a result of that, maybe let me talk a little bit about what we've actually seen as a response. It's been that focus on control. People really want to get control over what they can actually control. So if we talk about the manufacturing sector, it's actually looking at what I can control within the four walls of my factory. So a lot of focus on actually getting that data, getting that visibility as to what's actually happening. And also across the supply chain. I mean, when it first hit, there were huge issues. We didn't know where things were. So that focus on visibility. So again, in summary, I think it's been a shift to a focus on control to help us manage what we can actually manage, so that when we do get hit with uncertainty, we're in a better position to deal with it.
And Wolfgang, what are your thoughts?
My thought is that we have probably never seen in our lifetime such a massive shock, which didn't spare any space of our world. So combining that with what Chris mentioned, the uncertainty, we never know what the next day will bring. But in the past, it was more or less in a contained space. It was our company, our business partners, our ecosystem. Today, and that's also what Joe alluded to, it's everything. And from the beginning, this has not been just a supply shock. This has been a supply and demand shock, and we have seen shifts, erratic behavior, disruptions, pros and cons, ups and downsides in all parts. We can speak about governments that managed well certain areas and that disrupted others. We had very logical decisions in the shipping industry, taking capacity out, but suddenly we needed capacity. So I stop here because we have a lot of time to discuss all that, but it's the colossal dimension that we are facing in those times.
Indeed, Wolfgang, a lot to cover, isn't there? Raymon and Scott, perhaps as our two industry players, you both handle supply chains. What do you think have been the key challenges over the past year, and what are some of the key lessons that you've learned?
Well, if I had to choose one thing, Rachel, I would say space. Talking about belly capacity or airline capacity or ocean freight capacity, even till today, it's still hit and miss as to what's going to ship and what's not going to ship, and if you're going to make that important deadline. Yeah. So as a result of there not being enough space, we're paying a premium on rates, and that's really messing up our bottom line, right? Because you can't pass that freight cost on to your customers. So it's space and it's freight rates that are really the biggest thing that has been happening. Also, if you look at it from how we work, working from home is causing all sorts of issues, right? That connectivity with your people. We're expected to actually do more, and it's taking longer to do things because you can't sit in a room and have that dynamic conversation. You're going to be on air meet, you're going to be on video conferences, and that always takes a lot longer than actually speaking face to face with people.
Scott, your thoughts?
Yes, from the inside out, within a business. What laid bare for us on that shock that Wolfgang mentioned, and the macro effects that Chris and Joe were talking about, was that we got laid bare with our dependencies. We got found out where our gaps were in our supply chains, and we had to deal with them suddenly. It was a jaunt, and I think many organisations felt this, and that fear of what do we do now? We can't control the macro parts. We can't control the new trade barriers. We can't control the complexity of what's happening in the space. As Raymon mentioned, we can't control anymore. So what do we do? And those dependencies can be quite scary to deal with on the inside of a company. But knowing that a lot of mature and legacy companies trying to supply towards a dynamic demand that's shifting as suddenly as the supply shift itself has been really laid bare. And that's been the biggest part to know then how to start to filter through those dependencies and what to do about them in the future.
And great points there, Scott. And as you mentioned, how do you deal with issues when those, or how do you deal with shocks when they come up unexpectedly? And before the panel, you actually shared with us that you had quite an experience during the Suez Canal event that took place earlier this year. Can you share with us what your experience was and how you managed to overcome that? What were some of the lessons you learned, and how did you turn things around?
Yeah, certainly. It was an incident that I think that none of us expected, and I guess the visibility of our shipment information was not as good as we thought it was. We didn't realise how dependent we were on the Suez Canal. Obviously, a lot of other companies were more dependent on the Suez Canal than we were. So we had trade going eastbound and westbound through the Suez. So we had impact of around only 67 containers of all various either finished goods or raw materials or components. So we had to have plan B, plan C, plan D to be able to recover those positions without knowing really what we could do. So do we resupply or do we wait, not knowing how long the Suez would take to clear? Then the backlog, I think, is still catching up. Most of our product now is hit its destination finally, months after the incident itself. So these things do happen in the supply chain, and if the Suez incident happened in isolation to anything else that was happening, I think we wouldn't be talking too much about it right now. But in combination with the pandemic, in combination with the lockdowns, in combination with the supply shifts and the demand shifts so dramatically, this has played a huge impact on that massive shock to our supply chains.
How has that shifted things for you in the longer term and your strategy, Scott? What changes have you had to make?
Yeah, we have to assess our footprints in terms of where our supply base is, our locations, whether we're moving more onshoring, whether we stay offshoring, which markets are more important to us, which are more profitable, which do we serve first. All these normal questions that you answer, but you can optimize, are now becoming a harsh reality of we have to make choices rather than choosing to optimize. So it's been confronting, to say the least.
And Wolfgang, I know that you've got some interesting perspectives on the Suez Canal incident. Perhaps you'd like to share those with us. Wolfgang, I think your mic may need to be adjusted. Perhaps we can go on to... yes, go ahead, Wolfgang. We've got you back.
Yeah, what I always say is that we have to see the specifics of a situation, and that it's not a plain vanilla one-size-fits-all event. And for some companies, the Suez Canal may have been a disruption. On the other hand, we have to understand the performance of the maritime industry, which is at about 40%, which means that before the Suez Canal, 2 out of 3 ships have been delayed, and in average a week. If we think that this event has taken a few days and about the same days to, let's say, clean up the consequences, I agree with Scott that that was another, let's say, blip in the whole picture. We have, due to the COVID-19 situation and the colossal, let's say, impact it has on the economy, we are in a moment of extreme destabilization of every flow in the world. So the Suez Canal, for me, was a tragic event, but it was not the game-changing billion-dollar damage that some people made us or tried to make us believe. So that's my point. I just want to de-hype a bit the Suez Canal incident and put it into the overall perspective, because we have a lot of capacity constrained choke points in the world, and we have those because they were shortcuts. The Suez Canal is a shortcut. We have the solution. We go around Africa and we have, again, a flowing supply chain. But that brings in a bit more time, more cost, more carbon emissions. So that is maybe a very good illustration that every innovation and every good thing comes at a cost at a certain point.
So let's talk about the opportunities here, because while we're highlighting some of the challenges, as I mentioned in the introduction, where there are challenges, opportunities are given the chance to germinate. And Chris, I just want to bring you in, because in a recent IDC predictions report, it shared that by the end of this year, 90% of all manufacturing supply chains will have invested in the technology and business process necessary for true resiliency, resulting in productivity improvements of 15%. And by 2023, I believe, 65% of digitally transforming procurement organizations will have conscious savings tracking with real-time reconciliation to budgets and other business. Now, these are changes that have taken place on the back, or perhaps driven by what we've seen happen over the past year. Can you share more about some of those insights and what impact the events of the past year, COVID, the pandemic, and incidents such as the Suez Canal has had on these numbers?
So, I mean, there's some big predictions out there, and again, we're talking about a fundamental shift. You know, we're talking about the vast majority of organizations actually changing as a result of what's happened over the past year, 18 months. And I think the key thing that's driving this change is data. Again, I mentioned in my opening comment this focus on control. I mean, I think as soon as we actually, we started to see the challenges of COVID sort of roll out across the globe, people realized they didn't have control, they didn't have visibility, they didn't know what was going on. And so as a result of that, we've seen this shift, and a very dramatic and fast shift over the last 12, 18 months, where we've actually seen people have to make investments to actually get control, get visibility with that data, and then use it. So going forward, we're now starting to see this shift to be much more data driven. We know where things are. We also start to do the simulations. We can start to do the what if analysis, because we're actually getting more of that real-time data, and we can make decisions much faster, but also with an expected outcome. So I think in a nutshell, that's that fundamental shift to becoming much more data-driven, having that visibility, and having that visibility beyond tier one. As Scott was talking about, suddenly we didn't realize the impact that a lack of masks were having in a particular port, which meant the port couldn't actually operate. Those sort of scenarios popped up all across the globe. So data-driven, I think, is the answer, Rachel. To become more resilient, it's going to be data-driven.
And when you're talking about these investments and data, you're obviously talking about an investment that many companies need to make. Scott, perhaps you can share with us some of the investments or changes that you've made on the technology front on the back of what's been happening with the pandemic and the changes that we've seen within supply chains.
Yeah, we're at a really interesting cross-section as a business in terms of being a hunter and gatherer of data, as Chris mentions. Over the past sort of 5 years, to then what do we do? How do we use the data? And when the pandemic hit, our demand patterns were unrecognizable to the analytics that we had put in place on the platforms and the technology that we had brought into the company to help us analyze and predict. So we didn't really know what to do. We almost went back to being the hunter and gatherer, so gut feel approach. When our retail shops shut down across the US and Europe mid last year, moving to an e-com channel in double-digit percentage points is unprecedented, and we didn't have the systems and the technologies to deal with that, whilst we already had invested a lot in terms of the normal patterns, the normal forecasting tools. So we are redefining our IT roadmap and how we look at our platforms, both being together, working together, but also agile enough to be analyzing data rather than just being hunters and gatherers of that data.
I just want to bring Joe back in as well. And Joe, circling back to the beginning of the beginning, from your perspective, is it all about digitalization and data?
Rachel, well, it is and it isn't. As Chris said, and there was a very good presentation made earlier on in this session by his colleague Stephanie, who really put in perspective that we are now going through a period of reset, as you said earlier on. And what that really means is we're having to slow down to go forward, meaning that we've got to compromise the long term by taking control and adapting to the short term. Only then can we move forward. How we do that, how we readapt and how we tune, for sure data plays a big part in that technology transformation, because without data, you can't really plot your way forward. But in that quest for looking for data, there's a bigger picture where you actually got to get accurate data, trustworthy data to be able to move forward. And if data for data's sake is not really going to be of any value. However, people haven't understood yet that embracing data for the right reason is now a fundamental priority. It's a very, very strong enabler moving forward. And I think then this is where a lot of people are still missing the point of what digitalization really means. And the struggle goes on. The savvy guys, the 5-10% in the upper echelon of the industry are going well. The middle echelon are starting to find their way, but there's a big chunk, 50-60% of people are lost. And they may disappear because of that very fact, unless they find themselves very quickly. And I think Chris can attest to this in some of his findings and research that we've discussed in the past on.
You're listening to a panel discussion, global economic outlook, challenges and opportunities for supply chains and logisticians today, excuse me. This is part of Logisim Asia Pacific 2021 conference organized by Logisim Sphere Exhibits, a subsidiary of SPH and Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. We have with us on the panel Joe Lombardo, Director Project and Performance Management at ESP Consult, Wolfgang Lehmacher, Advisory Board Member at Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society, Dr. Christopher Holmes, Managing Director at IDC Insights Asia Pacific, Scott Phillips, Supply Chain Director, Global Shoes Production and Sourcing at ECCO Shoes, and Dr. Raymon Krishnan, President, Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. Now, gentlemen, before we continue, I'd just like to take a look at the Q&As that we have coming in on the side of the panel. We've got some wonderful questions that have come in, and perhaps I'd like to start off with this one. It's from Yok Fang, and it says, how do you see in the coming months, could we see more bottlenecks in goods supply, increasing in freight rates and rising prices of raw material, commodities and finished goods? Raymon, I know that you mentioned this briefly in your introductory comment as we started the panel. Would you like to comment on this?
Sure, Rachel. The short answer is yes. Things are not going to get better anytime soon. When you see one market opening up, you see another shutting down. I mean, what's happening in Singapore is a perfect example, right? For months, we were ahead of the curve, very low COVID-19 cases. We thought we were emerging into that better normal, everyone's getting vaccinated. But in the last week, we've more or less reverted back to the circuit breaker that we had before. This choppy situation is going to continue into the rest of the year. And the same is going to happen for freight capacity as well, because you're not going to have people traveling. So when you don't have aircraft flying, you're not going to have that belly capacity in aircraft. So that's always going to be a trade-off between what's available and how much you're going to be willing to pay for it. So anytime soon, no. I think this is going to plague us well into 2022 and maybe even longer. And it's anyone's guess as to how long the situation will last.
We've got another question here from Ali, and he's asked, can you share some specific insights about solutions as a result of COVID-19? Perhaps, Chris, would you like to take this one? Perhaps some solutions on the back of the findings that you've had from your IDC predictions and some of the tech that's been invested in by those that you've been surveying?
Yeah, certainly, Rachel, and it's a good question, because one of the things we do get asked quite a lot is, where should we actually be investing? How do we start? And as Joe said earlier, there's a lot of companies out there who are still challenged with this digital transformation and what it actually looks like. If you go back to some of the basics, I mean, some of the early approaches were just enabling operations to continue. So actually just giving people laptops so they could work from home, giving them access to the applications they actually need to do their job. So we've seen a shift as well to this software as a service model, being able to access all your work applications from the cloud, enabling you basically to work from anywhere. So that was almost a foundational piece. And then as we start to look as to, okay, this is that next normal, this is the way we're going to have to operate. We've seen people look at the technologies they've been using to actually run their operations. So for example, there's been a huge uptake around automated guided vehicles, AGVs, in warehouses, across shop floors. You've seen it in retail, you've seen it in hotels. But when we actually look at how many people we can have per square foot, we've actually had to improve, look at how we can actually embrace technologies to do that, so the automation piece. And then we can get into some of the specific applications. A huge focus around supply chain visibility, supply chain control towers, again, but enabled through the cloud and being able to, people can access that, work from anywhere. And also, as I talked around this data gathering, a huge emphasis as well around IoT technology. So starting to sensorize the factories, the supply chain, to give us visibility. Are our assets working? When can we expect it that we need to apply some maintenance? Where are things across the factory, across the supply chain? So that's just sort of in a nutshell, some of those focus areas that we've seen on those digital transformation roadmaps that people have actually implemented.
Wonderful.
Rachel, I'm just wondering if I could add something to that. Take this opportunity to actually take some risk as well. So it may sound something, it may not sound like the right thing to say, but I'll give you a couple of examples. We normally sign long-term service contracts with freight forwarders or shipping lines. But what we did was we said, let's go out there and do a spot rate pricing tool. And what we've seen at the end of the day is savings of 20, 30, even 40%. So while freight rates are high, we went out there, we tried this new tool, and we found that we're saving money. So take this opportunity, because the situation is so bad, take some calculated risk and leverage the situation to your benefit.
And just on that, Raymon, we've got another question here, and this is quite an interesting one for all of you, actually. And it says, I've been hearing more and more about the shift from just in time to just in case in the supply chain industry. What are your thoughts on it, and which industry or region do you think this does apply to, or perhaps not apply to? Scott, you're nodding there. I'm going to start off with you.
It depends on the definition of how you set your supply chain up pre-COVID. So automotive, just in time was the way of doing business, the way of doing supply chains. Now, with all the air cargo capacity being taken out, they've had a fundamental shift to maybe a just-in-case supply chain, a more reliable supply chain where inventory plays a much bigger part of their risk mitigation. In our industry, we were probably more just in case, and now we are trying to be more just in time. So changing that reliability in the supply chain to more of an agility, speed to maximize the demand shifts in the markets. So it's a really interesting question. It's a little cliche, just in time to just in case. It really depends on the industry. It really depends on where you were in your supply chain previous. And if you can understand that as a fundamental, I think you can answer your own question in your own business, work it out.
So I just want to highlight one issue that we haven't really spoken about yet, and that's manpower. And just going back to some of these IDC statistics, another one highlights that by 2023, 60% of G2000 manufacturers will leverage artificial intelligence to dynamically reserve and position service vehicles and customer site spare stock, decreasing mean time to repair by 25%. We've also got 50% of manufacturers accelerating the deployment of service robots to better manage specific operational tasks by 2022. So, you know, we've read a lot of reports, a lot of articles about the relationship between AI, robotics, and what this might mean for jobs at a time where we're seeing manpower impacted by the pandemic, by people's requirement for social distancing, medical leave. So what are your thoughts on how AI, automation, disruptive technology, what does this mean for supply chain manpower? Is this a solution? Is this a case of manpower alongside machine? Joe and Wolfgang, perhaps you'd like to share.
Absolutely, Rachel. This is the confusion and the fear that many people have, that AI and technology is going to replace the human being. It is not entirely. AI and technology will replace the mundane, routine jobs and roles, which in fact we are having already difficulty today finding in the market. And this will enhance the capabilities of people in terms of their potential to do higher added value activities. For example, when you take a job, an analytic job that a person today, a planner, takes maybe a day or a week to perform, keying in all the demand information, all the supply, all the manufacturing capacity, all the inputs that will throw out some planning tool, and you translate that into a machine doing that in a question of hours, and then that person can still analyze it and come out at a much better result. There's no discussion. It's really, a no-brainer to continue using the same methodologies when you've got the technology in place. Robotics, again, robotics helps in efficiency, helps in productivity, helps in reducing the cost base, that will increase the margins. Now, people who are fearful of losing their job should rethink about retraining, reskilling, and adopting the human resource in a different way. And that's where we need to go. And the longer we take to absorb that, understand it, the more companies are going to struggle. But there's no reason to, because there is a huge opportunity out there for technology side by side with man, with a human being.
But retraining and reskilling, Joe, sometimes is easier said than done. Wolfgang, what are your thoughts on man versus machine, or man alongside machine, when it comes to supply chain? Wolfgang, we can't hear you. Perhaps you'd like to go straight to audio. Wonderful. Thank you. Christopher, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on this as well. I can see you nodding there while we wait for Wolfgang to come back online.
Yeah, I think it's been this ongoing debate, and we've talked about automation in manufacturing and supply chain, warehousing, for the last 30, 40, 50 years. But I think more and more we're seeing it's becoming much more affordable when we start to talk of things like artificial intelligence. I mean, we actually foresee that we're no longer even going to be starting to talk around AI and machine learning. It's just going to be embedded in a lot of the applications that we're actually going to be using going forward. And it will just become part of the way we actually use the technology. We're going to get suggestions as to what are the outcomes that will happen if you make these decisions. So I think this is, when we start to talk more of those sort of planning and those office jobs, I think the physical adoption, as we talked around in terms of the warehousing and those AGVs, that's the starting point. But it's this real combination of the human being and the robot coming together, because there's certain things that humans do very well, and there's certain things that robots do very well. If you think some of the inspection jobs, where someone's sitting there looking through binoculars at a particular product and they're doing that for 8 hours a day, the quality drops off after the first 15, 20 minutes, whereas a robot will continue to do the same thing and pull out those.
Time for a coffee break, Chris, is that it?
Well, they don't have the coffee breaks. They also don't ring in sick. And also, I mean, what we're seeing with some of the machine learning now is that they can actually learn what's acceptable and what isn't. And so there's bits, the grey area starts to diminish. So you're actually looking at, in addition to all the comments Joe made, this increase in quality that comes out from use of that automation. But we're also starting to see that more countries around the region have got these Industry 4.0 initiatives going on, looking to upgrade the workforce, upgrade manpower. And I think that's going to be key going forward, because this advance in technology, it's not going to stop. It's embrace it. You've got to embrace it. There's going to be no option going forward.
Scott and Raymon, from industry perspective, perhaps you can share with us some examples of how you've managed to navigate this challenge of integrating machine and man when it comes to AI, automation, robotics within supply chains.
Yeah, Rachel, I think there's two aspects. One for us is we're a physical product company. So in our factories, we have preventative maintenance that's moved to more of an AI approach. Where the machine will know when it needs to be maintained rather than a mechanic going out there and knowing what to do. We've got a lot of robotics employed on the shop floor that take away certain mundane tasks. As Chris mentioned, we don't see a drop off in output rates when we have the robotics installed on the lines. The second part is the processing innovation or the way that we use technology and moving to 4.0. So optimizing information and getting the information to learn from itself. So how we make what product where to be in which market when, instead of massive spreadsheets and Excels that we always refer to as skilled human beings. Computer systems, algorithms can add to this aspect of the supply chain as well.
Raymon is
just to add,
go ahead.
A couple of years ago at one of our Logisticians, the theme that year was racing with the machine, because that was when RPA started being talked about, robotic process automation, and a lot of people was concerned that, my job's going to be displaced. I'm going to be replaced by an AGV or a robot or a cobot. But what's actually happening is like what Joe said. It's actually quite challenging finding people to do mundane, repetitive tasks. It's quite a challenge, especially now with the labor crunch, finding people to work in your warehouse and drive a forklift. So the jobs that are being replaced are actually not replacing people. It's actually augmenting or improving your performance because you have a labor shortage. Plus, at the same time, we also give our employees better chance to upskill themselves and do more thinking work rather than just repetitive work. I mean, I run a warehouse where we've got our WMS, our warehouse management system, and our SAP isn't connected. So you have someone keying in that data into the warehouse management system and then turning around and then keying that information into SAP. I mean, is that really necessary? Is that the best use of a person's time? And just imagine if you were that person doing it day in, day out, year after year. You'd shoot yourself. So it's not about being displaced, it's about working in and embracing that technology.
To summarize that, Rachel, you could actually say we are taking the robot out of the human being rather than replacing the human being. As a very eminent professor at Cranfield University put it during one of our webinars, take the robot out of the human being.
That's a wonderful way to summarize it, Joe. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm very mindful of time. I think it's flown past and completely escaped us. We've got just a few minutes left, but I just wanted to move on to the next topic. And we've got a question that kicks us off there as well. And that's from Stefano. And he asks, are we going to recover this space availability issue? I believe space was mentioned by Raymon during the introduction. If yes, by when? And how does this impact the sustainability and environmental impact of supply chains? I know that we've spoken about this quite a bit prior to the conference as well, in terms of one of the things that's come on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic is this increased conversation surrounding sustainability. So perhaps we can take a closer look at sustainability, supply chains, and as Raymon mentioned, space availability issue. Raymon, would you like to start us off here?
Well, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier. I don't think capacity is going to come back to the way it was before until the middle of next year, if at all. that will be quite fast. On the aspect of sustainability, I'm actually seeing quite a few people or organizations from the society's perspective put this on the back burner. We're all faced with day-to-day mission-critical stuff. The product needs to flow, the business needs to continue. So sustainability is, unfortunately, not on top of everyone's mind. You've also got to deal with the issue of greenwashing. A lot of organizations that talk about having sustainable practices, sustainable development goals, etc., they're just doing it for the press, and for their shareholders to make themselves sound good. And I think Wolfgang and I were talking about it some weeks ago, and it's something that we need to be mindful of as well.
Scott, perhaps you'd like to share your perspective on this as well. I know that Raymon's mentioned that perhaps sustainability may be put on the back burner, but as we look to, change the way in which supply chains or your supply chain strategy is modified, is sustainability something that you're incorporating into that?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And maybe a bit accused of greenwashing in the past with the pandemic that happened, or it's still happening. It gave us a chance to take stock of what we really mean by our sustainability agenda in the company. And we revised and actually published targets publicly that we will be held accountable for. So we are moving away from internally greenwashing. We didn't use it for publicity, to actually being part of the solution in our supply chain going forward with sustainability of materials, sustainability of waste, sustainability of how we move product and use less transport to have the right product in the right place at the right time. So these are things that now we will measure and we will actively achieve in the coming years to be part of the solution.
Would you say that's one of the key challenges when it comes to sustainability and supply chain, is finding that balance? Absolutely.
It's still a cost aspect to it, a financial aspect to it, to keep the shareholders happy. But it has to be part of the agenda now. It cannot be a question whether it's too much, too expensive, it's not efficient, it's too difficult. It has to be part, as Chris mentioned, data and innovation and technology has to be part of your core agenda. Sustainability has to be part of our core agendas in supply chain in all aspects going forward.
Definitely. And as you mentioned, this is something that business partners are asking about, investors are asking about. It's a topical conversation for most. So, Joe, what are your thoughts on where we're going with this and the industry? And perhaps, Chris, you'd like to share some insights as well, if I could bring both of you into the center.
Well, if I can summarize our discussion, which has been extremely interesting and enlightening, certainly the steps ahead of us, the current steps ahead of us, look extremely challenging. But what we must think about is the road ahead looks very exciting and will be very exciting if we embrace the technology and the trends that we are seeing evolving, and not fighting the trends, but embracing the trends and working within this new dimension of ecosystems, which actually gives us that confidence building, that leveraging of risk, leveraging of visibility, working with our customer, our customer's customers, our customer's customer, and supply. So we're going to the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3s. So really, the short term should not be confused with the long term. We have to work through this challenge, but build the blocks for the future, which is really going to be very interesting.
Joe, and that's a wonderful point to end off on as well. And I'd just like to tie this in with one last question that we've received from the panel, and that is, with COVID, this is a new norm. But when did the panel members think that we'll be able to identify the new baseline for what we call normal? Raymon.
Wow, let me pull out the crystal ball. I really think it's going to be a choppy, bumpy 12 months ahead. Nothing sooner than next year, if at all. That's when we can emerge from that to that better normal.
Wonderful. Wolfgang, is there anything you'd like to share? Are you back with us?
Yeah, if you can hear me. My
we've
view
got you
is,
back, Wolfgang. So when do you think we can see the new normal? Is this the new normal, or is this our baseline?
this is the new normal for a while. I think that we have to abandon the idea to put a timeline behind the next shift into something else. And that we have to put all energy into finding ways to manage that situation better than we do it today. And I know that deserves a panel in itself, but that's my message. We have to learn to live with what we have now.
Chris, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up? I can see you nodding there as well.
I totally agree with Wolfgang. I think this sort of this situation that we find ourselves in today, where there's huge fluctuations happening within very short time periods, I think that's going to be the way we're going to actually have to sort of design our operations, design our processes, and design our organization around. And I think if we do that, if we do come out of this and we do get into this next normal, whenever 12, 18 months, we'll be able to cope with it much better. But I think I would plan for this situation going on for a number of years moving forward.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. You've been listening to Logisim Asia Pacific 2021 conference. It's organized by Logisim Sphere Exhibits, a subsidiary of SPH and the Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. We've been joined by Joe Lombardo, Director, Project and Performance Management at ESP Consult, Wolfgang Lehmacher, Advisory Board Member, the Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society, Dr. Christopher Holmes, Managing Director at IDC Insights Asia Pacific, Scott Phillips, Supply Chain Director, Global Shoes Production and Sourcing at ECCO Shoes, and Dr. Raymon Krishnan, President, Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you all for your wonderful questions as well.
Thank you, Rachel.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.